Whether you are looking to build a new career or kickstart that new idea that you've got,
Microsoft Reactor connects you with the developers and startups that share your goals.
Learn new skills, meet new peers, and discover the latest in technology.
Events are running around the clock, so join us anytime, anywhere.
Reactors are communities to connect. We want you to meet real developers and entrepreneurs just like you. Here you can get skilled up and learn from our product experts in the Microsoft Cloud and in open source. So watch us on demand and share your own perspective as we live stream in communities all around the world.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another episode from the Copilot Chronicles series. My name is Rashmita, and I'm the event planner for Microsoft Reactor India. I'm here today joined by our very own host, Kamal, and our special guest speaker, Alistair. But before we start the session, I would request you all to read our code of conduct. We are all here to learn together, so please be respectful of other people's views, understanding of differences, being kind and considerate in the way you engage. The chat section is open throughout, and we do encourage you all to participate. Our speakers will answer all your questions during the session, so please feel free to drop all your questions in the chat section. With this, let me bring in Kamal.
Hey Rashmita.
Over to you, Kamal.
Hey Rashmita.
Hey, hi, can
Thank
you
you
hear me?
so much. Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, and the stage is all yours, Kamal.
Thank you so much, Rashmita. Hey, everybody, welcome to Copilot Chronicles. Thank you for joining for another series. As awaited, it's been one of the most wanted and asked topic in the Copilot Chronicle, which is the MCP. So, without further ado, today we are going to have an amazing speaker who's going to talk about MCP, getting started with it. What are the fundamentals about it? Initially, we used to talk about LLM, a copilot, a lot of things about it, but these days everybody is into MCP. What is it all about? They say you can think it like an USB for AI. What does it does? What is its architecture? How does it work internally? And the architecture part, or how do I build and deploy servers? So a lot of things would be covered. So without further ado, let me introduce today's speaker, Alistair, who is the MCP, who's an MVP, a podcaster, and he's been running a lot of community events in Cape Town. So, Alistair, thank you so much for joining the Copilot Chronicles, and the stage is all yours to dwell deep dive into MCP.
Good now. I suppose saying good now, I don't know where in the world everyone is dialing in from. And yes, thanks, Kamal. We are very excited to talk about getting started with MCPs, or Model Context Protocols. My name is Alistair Pugin, and I'll be your captain for this journey into the MCP abyss. Now, it was funny when I was doing a little bit of research on this. There's not a lot of information internal to this, but when you start looking at what's available to you across the world in such a short amount of time about how to build MCPs, the differences between the client, the server, and the architecture, and what you can actually do from an MCP perspective in connecting disparate applications to generative AI. It's actually fascinating at the rate of change that we've seen across the globe with organizations adopting generative AI and agentic AI, which is what is probably where the world is going to over the next 2 to 3 years. And at the rate of change, with Satya saying that, Moore's law is no longer a thing. With Moore's law, the entire IT industry has been focusing on Moore's law, where it says the average amount of transistors doubles every 18 months. And we've kind of stuck to that over the last 30 years. But with Satya saying that law no longer exists and we are doubling in technology every 6 months, it's quite scary to think about the opportunities made available to the world, because everyone is doing AI. Right? If you look at over the last month, we've seen Microsoft build with massive announcements. There was quite a cool demo on pretty much similar to what we're going to look at today around what is MCPs, and I'll drop a link to that YouTube video later on in the chat. Definitely go and actually go look at what I think the guy's name was. James Montemagno's, I can never say his surname, James Montemagno's information at Build around model context protocol. And also some of the stuff that I'm going to be showing is not limited to just Microsoft. I think it's important to note that, for the longest time, we've talked about, being cloud native and everything that you can build inside of, and this is not limited to Azure. Everything that you can do inside of Azure, you can also do inside of multiple platforms. And the platforms that I'll be focusing on outside of looking at MCPs in Copilot Studio, I'm also going to be exposing you to some new stuff like Clara and also N8N, which is one of my personal favorites. So just a little bit of housekeeping. Hi there, my name is Alistair Pugin. I am a Microsoft MVP, and I've been doing things for the longest time, working with what I like to call enterprise content management, right? And this is the unstructured data of your world. Everything that goes and lives inside of SharePoint, everything that lives inside of Teams, which is SharePoint, that's my background. I started off as a developer, as a COBOL developer, a COBOL programmer back in the mid-90s, and I moved into infrastructure and a few other things. So yes, I may have a developer background, but I traditionally don't write code. So I just want to qualify and clarify that up front. I am not the guy that's going to be building applications using Visual Studio Code. I'll spend time in Visual Studio Code, and I've got a Visual Studio Code, some stuff that lives inside of Visual Studio Code that I'll show you, but I'm not the developer's developer. I spend time with customers at an architecture level, helping them understand technology and how they can adopt and modernize their platforms. And for the longest time, for probably the last year, we've been talking aggressively to customers because everyone wants to know what generative AI is, what agentic AI is. Can you do agent-to-agent communication? What does Copilot Studio does, and all the other agent stuff that lives inside of Microsoft 365. And naturally, with these conversations where we start talking to customers about, how do you add knowledge, the big shift, add knowledge to generative AI, it's become quite apparent that we need some sort of structured mechanism for talking to data living in these various repositories, and that's always been the thing. Now, when we look at where MCP started, and for those who haven't seen this logo, it's from Anthropic. When we look at the large orgs out there, you've got Anthropic with Claude, and I'll be focusing quite a bit on Claude today because MCP as a concept has really started with Anthropic saying that we need some sort of structured framework for how AI, or at least your typical open web UI front end, the GPTs that you've seen, everyone's gone to ChatGPT, what we've seen from that and how we connect that to knowledge, and we also structure the response from knowledge in a more formalized way. Because right now you can jump into ChatGPT, you can go to Copilot Chat, you can go to the Claudes of the world, which is from Anthropic, or you can use platforms like Perplexity to ask it a question and it will give you a response. Even so far as now, when you do searches in Google, they give you a knowledge-based answer and an SEO-based answer. And we're very excited when Anthropic said, well, can we not do something different? And because we want to attach, in the old days with robotic process automation, we'd build a chatbot and we'd attach it to some sort of knowledge source, but it wasn't very regimented or structured. With the advent of generative AI, and the GPTs of the world, a very different approach. Yes, we can expose it to a language model like Llama, or pick a flavor of LLM or SLM or MLM. But how do we actually hone that data so that we can almost tabularize the responses in a meaningful way? And that's really what the world started looking at. We've got this massive API framework where everyone's got some form of API, and that's been the biggest issue. So how do we connect AI or our AI to apps and give it functionality? We've been building, service buses for the last 20 years structurally and saying, well, this is the mechanism for you to connect to a backend. When we look at how agents actually work inside of Microsoft 365 or in Foundry, typically when you deploy an agent, it creates an application registration with permissions back into some sort of knowledge source. So with all these APIs, do we really go through that entire process of we're using APIs? Every single agent that we build inside of an environment requires an API, and it needs to understand the API, right? Because there's so much out there. And for the longest time, we struggled with connecting APIs to agents because it needed a specific level of understanding, right? And from an integration perspective, you can definitely do it. Nothing is stopping you from doing that. But, today we've got, like I mentioned earlier on, and that was just the top of my head. You've got the Anthropics, you've got the Googles, you've got the Microsofts, and you've got AWS has got it, OpenText has got it, and they've all got some form of AI that you can use and consume. And you've got multiple AI providers, and they all have specific APIs, right? Isn't there an easier way to start connecting to these things? And there's a ton of tooling from OpenText content management, and they've got a specific way of responding to technology and responding to a front end. And for the most part, we've spent a lot of time trying to integrate into APIs. Now, when we look at citizen development as a concept, and as everyone has moved into this sort of no code, low code, pro code, and we've always talked about Microsoft Copilot being the UI for AI. Naturally, we've moved on to, well, it's great to expose knowledge to a Copilot or an agent, but can we do more? And can we connect it to more complex solutions, right? And then how do we wrap security around that as well? And it's not only been the concern of consultants or architects like myself working with Microsoft technology, but it's also been a concern for the entire world, right? Because we've seen a massive uptake in AI. It's probably the fastest growing technology since the advent of the integrated circuit, and from a complexity and understanding perspective, we've seen a lot of organizations also say, well, how do we scale this? Because the technology is there, the capacity is there, but how do we reduce that time to value, right? And that's really where, all of these things stems from, because if you look at the amount of language models that's on huggingface.io, I think it's over 500,000 language models. So how do you simplify all of this and make access to platforms a little bit easier? And in the old days, you'd go out and you'd buy, TIBCO, from WebSphere or EntireX or some sort of integration broker so that you could build this massive service bus. Didn't matter what platform you were coming from Java, C#, it really didn't matter. But you'd have a set of instructions that you would use, either a get or a post, and this is what you'd adhere to in the traditional way that you would do, configuring API, connecting to an API, extracting and posting data to and from that. In today's world, a little bit different, right? And what Anthropic has actually done, they've created a specific standard around how you connect AI to knowledge and knowledge to AI. and also spin that up into how do we connect to other applications as part of building, this agentic framework that we currently occupy space in, right? You'd seen Microsoft drive quite hard AI Foundry and all the tools, and we've spoken at the developer camp specifically about this, around all the tools that's available to you from Microsoft. But today I want to focus a little bit more on the science behind it, and then also look at a few practical examples of how you can start working with MCPs in your environment. So what is an MCP, or what is Model Context Protocol? It's a traditional mechanism, or at least the standard, that enables integration between the applications that you want to build, the agentic side, and what you're doing on the front end, like Open Web UI, with tools and data sources specifically, right? So it connects AI apps and agents to tools, data sources, but really MCP is letting, or Model Context Protocol is letting the agentic or the AI, the GPT side, interact meaningfully with the rest of the world, instead of saying, I can't send that email, or I don't understand what REST API is, from a web dev perspective, So it's a massive thing when we look at how all of this is glued together using Model Context Protocols as a standard, because that's what it is. It's a standard. And organizations across the globe for the last 2-3 months have been releasing MCP servers, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's really, it's been open source. So Microsoft's building their own MCP server, and I'll show you what that looks like. Everyone else is also building their MCP server. It's an open standard. It allows you to securely connect AI with your applications, tools, and capabilities. So really what you should be doing is going back to your app stack and speaking to those vendors for applications that you are currently consuming, and asking them if they've got an MCP server with an MCP client that you can utilize to connect to the application backends that you may have, right? And it's really there to help you control access to application resources and also contextualize the data that's coming through. And, over the last, I don't know how many months, we've actually seen this grow exponentially, and I'll show you, where to get this information from. And it's not just from Anthropic. There's a host of MCP libraries that you can actually go to. And when we look at the world today and how it scales, there's official MCP servers that you would, procure from, the likes of SAP or AWS. And then also, there's community-created servers, because there's a massive community behind this. And when we look at, where this is, and, the concept of MCP coming from an Anthropic, and in this example, it's a simple example. It's just Claude, right? You'd have multiple MCP servers, but the vision for this is actually to move on from that, so that you can actually have some sort of gateway that manages the communication between MCP servers. Whether or not I think this is where we're going to end up in, I mean, the idea behind MCP servers is not to build another service bus, but you're going to start looking at building service buses for multiple MCP servers inside your organization, So being able to also then manage multiple MCP servers with the necessary credentials. And then we start looking at, architecturally at an enterprise level, what this entire world is going to look like. So now that we have had an idea of I suppose it's just an introduction to what Model Context Protocol does. It's the new service bus concept when you start wanting to expose knowledge and platform and applications to the GPTs of the world, right? That front end, I want to ask my data questions. What does it actually look like? And it's super easy when we start looking at how this is built, and it's not just for Claude. You've got an MCP host, right, that has multiple clients. So it could be Open Web UI, and I'm going to show you a few things in that. It could be some form of IDE, if you're vibe coding. It could also be agents that live somewhere, if we're building an agent in Copilot. And those things then interact with the MCP server. And from a context perspective, for those that have built any sort of agents in Copilot Studio, you can create starter prompts. You can contextualize those starter prompts. You'll also give it access to specific resources and tools when it needs to perform a function. And then based on those resources and tools, it can either find information living in a file share somewhere. It can interrogate and kick off processes via triggers in external applications, and also connect to structured data, which has always been a tricky thing. So if you think about wanting to extract tabular information in a meaningful way from a database, you'd need to connect to the database, understand the schema. But when you start looking at MCP service for something like Postgres, there's contextualization at a database level for that information. And when we look at its core, what the architecture actually looks like, you've got resources, tools, context, and prompt, right? Prompt specifically, and I suppose everyone has been working in some way, shape, or form with what prompts actually look like. And at its core, when we look at what this whole concept of MCPs look like, it's really about being able to represent resources that you want to connect to, the tools. A simple example, let's say I want to connect to a database for a platform like OpenText Content Server. Great. It could be Oracle, it could be Microsoft SQL, pick a flavor, pick a database. I would need to have a database client, connect to it, and then somehow I'd need to figure out how to write a SQL query to query the database or the data that's stored inside of tables inside of the database. Now, if I don't know anything about the platform, there's no way that I'm going to understand the relational data, how a content server actually stores data in the database, where the metadata is stored, where the versions, does it store the content as blob storage? What does that look like, right? With an MCP server into, let's say, content server, that structure would be already built for you from a tools and a resources perspective. The understanding of what content is stored and how content is stored at a database level would be presented back to you through the MCP server. And then also the context of said data living inside of that. And then from an application perspective, you wouldn't have to build that intelligence there. You would use, your host application that you may have been built, that you may have built yourself, or using something like OpenWeb UI, and then connect the client to that so that you can actually pass data across to go fetch information for you and represent that data back through the client layer in a meaningful way to you. So I wouldn't call it a Swiss Army knife, but when we start looking at what that means, you've got these applications that want to access data through it. So in your case, you might want to expose data stored in an ERP system to an LLM so that you can, have that generative query available to you. And architecturally, it is managed by what you're looking at on the screen right now. So it's not just a interface from a client perspective, because we've spoken about what this actually looks like from a server perspective. Yes, a lot of people call it out as fully featured middleware. I think middleware is a strong statement. But when we start talking about the MCP client, it does a lot of the communication from an orchestration perspective. It's going to look at that context. It's going to look at the tools that it can use to extract data from your knowledge. In this case, we're calling it knowledge. And also, it's going to maintain that session state, because you would want to make sure that the model that you are talking to, you can retain the memory, because it's all queryable. When we look at what lives underneath that from a query processing perspective, and how it's going to handle response, how it's going to manage the handling of responses, and how it can return that information back in a meaningful way to you, we need to understand why the client part is important, and also how you use because for the most part, your users are going to ask it questions. We've seen studies done over the last 2 years where people have to figure out how to move away from using a GPT as a search engine. For the most part, people are saying, well, we use 7 words to query this and we expect a great result. And everyone is going to have to figure out how to write really good prompts. And that's why prompt engineering is a thing. Right? So from a client perspective, once you've got the server connected to the knowledge or the data sources that you want it to connect to, you are then going to start looking at how that client interacts with that server to manage the communication between your front end. And there's a ton of tools available when you start looking at, the components that make up the server. So retrieval search, we've spoken about that now. Being able to send a message, so that get and that post functionality, and then also in this sort of context, can we actually write information that the user has given to us via a prompt to something like structured data? Because typically when we look at the GPT side of things, it's really just having a conversation with some form of AI. Right? So tools, resources, and prompts. And structurally, this is where it becomes important, because you now have the facility inside of the MCP to do structured posting back to an application, right? And that MCP server manages the way users would then communicate with back-end sources when it comes to being able to update a table or update a document in a uniform fashion, right? So think about the server component in these 3 key pillars: tools, resources, and prompts, and also how they specifically function when we start looking at various layers. So you've got the protocol layer and the transport layer. I'm not going to delve too much into that. If you do want to know a little bit more about that, please reach out to me. In the interest of time, I want to jump into, what the platform could possibly look like on the front end and how to, connect to MCP servers and things like that. When we look at the various transport types that you can actually run through, local transport, and again, I want to jump into a demo before we run through all of these things. The streamable HTTP stuff, and it's all brand new. And something to note that when we look at the newness of this, a lot of people will go and try something and it doesn't work, and then you hate the platform. Don't think of it that way. These things are so new. A lot of the times we don't know what the expectation is going to be from the customer, and we're trying to implement this, and you might not necessarily get it right today, but I guarantee you, as you go through this, it's going to become a lot easier. Now, I'm going to jump out of this because I want to show you, what this looks like. And there's a few ways to build your own custom MCP service. I'm going to stop sharing. And I actually should have just stopped not sharing in that way. Okay, go back there, share, and I'm going to drop straight out of the presentation. So a couple of things. There's a lot of collateral available to you around what Model Context Protocol is. There's an entire page that talks to this. You can actually get access to it via GitHub as well. But for those that really want to have a look at what MCPs are, it's exactly what I've done. That's exactly what I've explained earlier on. And it's super simple to get started. Now, for those who haven't built anything in this world, it's perfectly fine. Don't worry about it. You don't need necessary infrastructure in your building or rely on what you need to do on the back end from a server infrastructure perspective as well. For those that are wanting to, I'm going to show you how to deploy specific tools inside of your environment that will go a long way into getting you to test these things without having to spend a lot of money inside of Azure credits or anything like that. So I encourage you to head over to modelcontextprotocol.io and actually read through, how to get started. I mean, there's Naturally, this is driven by Anthropic, so they're going to talk about Claude desktop users. But depending on what you want to do, you can build your own server and drop it in the background and actually use this to interact with. Some other ways of doing this, and naturally, because this is Microsoft, I'm going to talk a little bit about Copilot, and let me start there. So for those that have been exposed to Microsoft 365 Copilot, typically for the users that don't have Microsoft 365 Copilot licenses, they would usually just see the generic chat. You can build agents and deploy it to users who are not licensed for Microsoft 365 Copilot. It's a different license model. It's a Copilot Studio license. It's pay as you go. So when you start thinking about, building agents and connecting these agents to Microsoft 365 or even to Copilot Studio, you should definitely have a look at the license model between building agents for non-Microsoft 365 Copilot licensed users, because you can get exactly the same functionality based on usage. So I've built an agent in Copilot Studio, and this is just a simple agent. And what this agent is going to do, it's connected to a knowledge source, so I could ask it, Microsoft Cyber Security Reference Architecture. And this is going to use knowledge that I've configured, and I'll show you what it looks on the back end. And it's actually going to produce information for me based on this. Also, I haven't sacrificed the chicken to the demo gods. So I apologize if the demos don't work, but hey, this is actually working. So it's brought back a result and it's formatted it for me. Purpose and objectives, key components, and it's also referencing a document that's stored in a SharePoint library. Now, when we actually look at that, right, this is the agent that I built. It's exposed to a SharePoint library. There's an overview of the information there. There's some knowledge. I haven't built any tools, and I'm going to show you what that's going to do now. I haven't added any topics or activity. And yes, you can derive analytics from this. I have published it to both Teams and the Copilot chat side, and then also SharePoint. But I want to focus on the tools. Now, remember we said earlier on that from an MCP perspective, Anthropic launched the concept of MCPs, and everyone has been, driving this quite hard to actually allow you, especially in the Microsoft world, and this is just Copilot Studio. I'm not going to jump into Foundry, but I just want to show you a simple way of actually adding, from an MCP perspective. And you'll notice for those that actually live inside of Copilot Studio, you now have the option to filter by MCP. I mean, you can add a connector, you can add a flow. In this case, I'm just going to click on MCP and show you what that looks like. Now, currently, we can go and we can configure, and this is new. Yesterday, it was just this one, but I can go and say, I want to connect to Fabric to extract data. I don't have any connections in here right now. If I really wanted to, I can create a new one, and it's going to ask me to log in and do a whole bunch of other things. So I don't want to take you through too much of that right now, but I mean, I can simply just log in. And if you don't have a Fabric workspace on the back end, I can go and say, okay, allow access, and it's going to do a few things on the back end. So now I can go configure that. And then if Fabric has got access in very much the same way to a data source, a brick, a lake, or a factory, or a one lake in this case, you can now start exposing that data to your Copilot agent that you've actually built. So I'm not going to do it now. So Microsoft provides you with functionality to connect to in Copilot Studio today, Fabric, and as we go on, there's going to be more, and you can bring your own MCP server as well, and you can bring your own LLMs to AI Foundry as well. But what I want to show you today is how I use other platforms that you can also use outside of heading to AI Foundry and grabbing some credits and things like that, or, the Copilot Learning Hub, and how you can start building this inside of your organization. For those of you that want to deploy it locally, there's many ways to do this so that you can start fiddling around. You can literally deploy it onto your desktop. I'm running Windows 11 here, and these things, well, with the exception of N8N, you can spin up N8N inside of a Docker desktop and run it locally as well. All right, I'm going to show you another application called Clara, which is all self-contained, and it gives you an easier way to work through these things. Now, when we look at what Microsoft has actually published specifically around MCP, you can head over to Microsoft's GitHub page, and they've actually got .NET samples for MCP. It's a simple thing marked down to HTML, a to-do list, and you can actually deploy this inside of Visual Studio and actually have a look around this. And I encourage those that are developers on this live stream to head over to, I'm just looking at the chat, head over to github.com/Microsoft and then grab the MCP.NET samples and pull it into an environment so that you can actually have a look at what it's doing inside of Visual Studio Code. Some of the things I wanted to touch on today is, you've got this available from Microsoft, but there's a ton of server directories. And this is just a simple one. There's a Slack MCP server. And if you wanted to connect to Slack and post messages inside of Slack, you could do that. It's the same with Google Drive. And I specifically stayed away from focusing on Microsoft today to show you that, from a cloud native perspective, whether you're living in AI Foundry or in Copilot or in N8N, the technologies are pretty much the same, right? If you wanted to connect to Teams from Copilot Studio and allow Teams, an agent to live in Teams that's going to connect to a file system, or any of the other agents, not agents, the directories that are available to you. This is quite a small one, but there's another site that you can head over to, mcp.so, and they are publishing so many of these MCPs that you can use to consume inside of your organization. It's just fascinating at the rate that these things are being updated. So let me give you an example. I'm going to show you what it looks like inside of N8N. The reason why I enjoy N8N is because I can host it locally, so it's running in my lab. And this is the community edition. If you don't want to do that, you can actually literally head over to n8n.io, I think, and you can actually do stuff in the cloud. It's the same for Claude on the Anthropic side. It's the same for Perplexity. You can literally go in there, and I can connect to Perplexity from something like N8N. But because of the amount of tests we want to do, we've got stuff built locally inside of our labs so that when we build agents, not just focused on Copilot Studio. We've got agents that we're currently building that does discovery for Entra ID, right? And it's just easier to build it here and then port it across to Foundry, so that we can fiddle with quite a lot of things. So here's a simple, let's have a look at this MCP template. And what's nice about N8N, you can actually download these templates and actually have a look at what it actually does. This is a template I literally just pulled right now and I added it. So here's an N8N workflow MCP server. And when I actually look at what it looks like, I'll be able to see that it's connecting locally. Obviously, there's an authentication context. And from a settings perspective, it performs specific functions. Right now, it's not doing much of anything, but I can run through the test. I don't think it's going to run right now because I haven't connected it to anything. But if I go out of it, you'll notice that I can pull specific workflows. I can add a workflow using this MCP server. So exposing this externally to a client. So in this case, I would want to connect it to an agent with an MCP client. I can then communicate directly with N8N external to N8N. So expose that across. And then, it's scrolling going down. When we look at, I can connect it to OpenAI, and I can actually then build out that prompt engineering side using OpenAI's chat model, not just limiting it to what is actually happening inside of N8N. And it's super simple. I mean, this is just a template that I pulled in, and you can actually have a look at how all of these things work. In this case, simple things like workflows. Well, this one is not too simple, but being able to filter through a lot of information using N8N's MCP server infrastructure to run specific agents inside of your environment. The other one that really interested me over the last couple of days, and this is new, you can actually download this specific service. It's called Clara, right? And I didn't spell my name right, but I mean, I could start chatting with Clara. I don't have a model enabled yet. So I can go and I can add a new service or a new model, and I can connect that to OpenAI and use that inside of the environment. But this is an entire interface that allows you to build locally on your desktop. So you don't have to worry about connecting to the cloud and throwing money at that. But you can actually download Clara, run it in your environment, start looking at the settings. Actually, that's what I wanted to go to, the settings, and looking at extensions where I can literally, I mean, this one is actually connected to a GitHub repo. And I can add additional servers from an MCP perspective as long as I know what I'm connecting to. And I can expose it that way to this. I mean, look at this. Remote MCP server, so I can connect to an MCP server via HTTP. And I mean, in your case, you might want to connect to a GitHub repo and run this locally so that you can start playing around with the concept of MCPs before you start spinning anything up there. So I encourage you to have a look at what's available from N8N, the community edition, where you can run it locally on your desktop like this. All it's going to do is it's going to want to run Windows subsystem for Linux on Windows 10 or Windows 11. It's going to enable that, and then you can run this locally, and you can actually get started with building MCPs before you go and start looking at what it looks like inside of AI Foundry. Clara is available for free. So is the N8N Community Edition. And then the last thing I wanted to look at is how do you actually pull MCPs into a project inside of Visual Studio? Now, this is super simple, right? If we actually just go and look at the extensions from a marketplace perspective, there's a ton of MCP capabilities available for you. I mean, it's literally, there's an MCP server built by whoever Block is. And all you have to do is search to find out what's actually happening from an MCP perspective. I mean, there's some Figma extensions if you are using Figma. There's an Atlassian MCP server that connects Visual Studio Code to some Jira board on the back end. And you could literally just install it. And then use it inside of a project. And they talk to you about how to use that. Super simple. And then naturally, if you are writing code for this, it's going to scaffold everything for you in the back end when it comes to that. So coming back to, not only understanding what MCP is, but there's a massive marketplace out there for you to do self-hosted things inside of your environment so that you can build an MCP server, you can build a MCP client, and in this case, I'll be using Clara for that because, I don't want to do all those scaffolding. I can add specific AI services. I can deploy local models if I wanted to. I can then configure extensions for that. In this case, it's an MCP server from an extension perspective. I can then go and, build tools to talk to that. I can add additional services if I wanted to connect this to N8N, which I don't have running currently. And then it's the same thing with, some sort of Llama service in the back end. So nothing's stopping you today from going to N8N or getting some Azure credits, because you can sign up and get $200 worth of Azure credits, and spinning up, agentic AI in your environment and starting to, play with these tools. And actually for the developers out there, this is Visual Studio Code, so you don't need full-blown Visual Studio, where you can start writing code against these agents that you want to build living inside of N8N. Now, there's probably an N8N extension here as well, which I haven't checked to see. there we go. So I can install this. And I can actually connect to this N8N instance that's currently running. Where is it? And did I close it? Oh, there it is. And I can actually then create a workflow and actually trigger it directly from Visual Studio Code if I was building a front end for this. Okay, let's go back to those slides. Where are we? Okay. So from an Anthropic's perspective, when we look at where they are, and they've moved on from March, it's really about being able to, and as much as MCPs are available and the concept and the framework is available for MCPs, there's a lot that's happening on the back end. You know, even if you look at Microsoft building out all these functions, I mean, we're waiting for the GitHub one. Let's see if I can pull up more things. From, you know, there's an MCP SDK for you to build your own MCPs that you can pull back into Copilot. From a tooling perspective, make it available here so that you can actually consume, you know, MCP-like services inside of Copilot Studio. There's a lot of work that's happening in the background, but you can start today building your own MCP servers and always reference the information available to you from, you know, everyone's going to have their own stuff, but Anthropic is really driving this framework. And you'll see updates come through from Anthropic that most people from a framework perspective is going to be consuming. And that will start filtering through to not only Microsoft, but also, you know, wrapper companies like N8N. Clara is brand new. This is brand new. This dropped like, I think, a month ago, for you to start having a look at how to build all of these things out. And I think that's it from me. I hope you enjoyed, you know, this introduction session to what you could possibly be extending, looking at the extensibility of building agents inside of your environment. It's not just about a prompt, it's about being able to connect to knowledge, not just unstructured data, in very much the way you've seen me actually connect, you know, Copilot to data that lives inside of something like SharePoint, but you'll be able to take that and eventually get to a stage where you are connecting agents, multiple agents, and that's coming to Copilot Studio, where you've got A to A, agent to agent communication, where you could literally build a help desk agent that's going to go fetch tickets out of ServiceNow, because that functionality does almost, well, it does exist. You can connect it to ServiceNow from an agent perspective, and then have users interact with that agent to perform specific functions like closing a ticket inside of ServiceNow, just from being able to instruct it here. And MCPs give us a much easier way to communicate with backend systems. And you also get the flexibility of building additional functionality into that MCP server. And I think if Kamal's still on, I don't see any questions in the chat. I'm following the comments inside of StreamYard.
Yeah, definitely. Firstly, thank you so much for this practical guide. I would say it was like a deep dive. Even I did not get to know so many
Yeah.
concepts about MCP. Only when I get to know so many things are there now, this really kind of wows me, and I'm like, I definitely want to give a try and see how it works. So in general, I always have these questions. When I initially tried MCP, I was like, how is the security considered in terms of MCP, which is always a major concern.
Yes.
So what's your thought about it?
So there's a couple of things, right? When we look at, and security is a big concern. It's always going to be a big concern. And for those that actually, you know, follow what what threat actors do. There's been some exploits around how you can send prompts across to generative AI and get it to perform functions that it shouldn't be allowed to. Now, I will use Microsoft as a perfect example of how Microsoft does security when it comes to agents. And that's a great question, Kamal. So when we look at, and Pablo, I'm going to come back to you around the MCP server for Copilot Studio and, an agent in Foundry. I'll get to that now. But when we look at what Microsoft does when building agents. So this is a data overload agent. I've got a few agents running here. I'm going to focus on this. So what happens here is, and this data overload agent is actually exposed to this knowledge, right? So if I actually looked at that link, let's just open that link. I'm going to, it's hybrid work. Let's just go there. That's the actual library that this is not to be confused with SharePoint agents, because Copilot Studio agents are a little bit different to the, if this actually comes up. If I go to the root site, you'll notice that every site inside of Microsoft 365 now ships, as soon as it pops up, it ships with its own agent. Now, this agent is grounded, and if you've got a Microsoft 365 Copilot license, this will light up for you inside of your tenant. So if you've got the license, every SharePoint site that gets deployed inside of your tenant gets its own agent. And you'll notice when I click on the traditional Copilot bar that pops up, there's an agent that's attached to hybrid work, and I can ask this agent, and this agent is grounded in the context of what's happening inside of this site collection, right? Well, it's a site, but we call it a site collection. Now, from a security trimming perspective, I want to show you how this one actually works. This one looks at that specific library. If I go back, and you'll notice that there's also agents that live inside of this. That one is not living inside of this library. And if you want to know a little bit more about that, I can talk about that too. So what happens is I've connected this agent that now lives inside of the chat interface, or at least the Copilot chat, as an agent, and I can query this, right? From a security posture perspective, this agent, if we look at what it actually looks like on the back end, so if I go to portal of Azure, leave, and I go to Entra, and I go to, it should be under application or enterprise apps. Let's just have a look, see. I think it'll show up. Let me just go back, and application registrations, all apps, data. There we go. So what it actually does, just from a security posture perspective, it actually creates an application registration for that agent. And when I look at, where am I going? The API permissions, because there's no permissions added here. But from an authentication perspective, it is only authenticated against users that live in the tenant, because that's how I deployed it. And then when I actually look at functionality, even though the user might have access to the agent, from a security trimming perspective, it's only going to show results that this user has access to. So in very much the same way that search works inside of Microsoft 365, it will go and find information, it will collate that information, and then return the information back to me that I have access to. So if I did not have access to this knowledge repository that's added to the agent, I would not be able to get this data back. So this is grounded inside of the security that lives inside of your Microsoft 365 tenant. Even though you've published an agent and it's available through Teams or through Copilot Chat, it doesn't mean that people who have access to the agent would have access to the information that's stored, or would have access to the information that Copilot has access to. Now, from a security posture perspective, this is also grounded inside of your tenant. So any data that you would upload, in this case, if I had to, add content, I'm not allowed to add content here, but if I had to add content to Copilot, it doesn't leave your tenant boundary. From an external security posture perspective, this is managed inside of my tenant, and you'll notice that when I create an agent, it's limited to the organizational directory only. And because when I published it, I said I'm publishing it to Teams and Copilot. If I did that, let me just select that channel. You will notice that there's obviously authentication baked into this. So where I make it available, and then if I had to do it to a demo site, you'll notice it will complain because I'm actually doing authentication, and I'm doing modern auth on this. Now, from an authentication perspective, you should actually start looking at phishing-resistant MFA that you've deployed inside of Entra. So authentication is managed and authorization is managed through Entra ID and all the security parameters that come with that. So protecting high information is added to any agent that you build inside of the environment and how it's exposed. If you're worried about data loss or data leak prevention, Microsoft's identity score, the cloud security posture management that comes with this, it's grounded inside of how you configure your security for Microsoft 365.
Perfect. I think that answers my questions and a lot of things about security. So it's safe, it's secure, and a lot of measures are being taken here. So I think it definitely, yeah.
It's a big question for us, spending a lot of time in the data security space. If you are looking at worrying about how AI is in your organization, you can head to Purview. Purview's got a blade called Data Security Posture Management for AI so that you can track AI usage inside of your organization. There's a lot you can do with prohibiting people from uploading content to external AI, like if someone is using ChatGPT or they're using Perplexity, you can block uploads. The recommended approach for rolling out Microsoft 365 Copilot is you've got to deploy sensitivity labels so that you protect sensitive data. You'll also, from a SharePoint Advanced Management perspective, you can now restrict certain sites from being indexed by Microsoft Search, because what happens is you've got the semantic index and the semantic kernel that Copilot uses that actually connects to the search index of your tenant. So you can exclude specific sites so that even if you were using the generic AI search that's coming, you can prohibit people from seeing sensitive information that might live inside of your HR directory, or you've got a site for HR that has salaries inside of that. You can. It's all part of the Copilot technical readiness that you should take your organization through.
True, very true, Alistair. So definitely that's something, I think it's another area of a topic of discussion where we can talk about the security measures, how secure is your data, what really happens when data is fed or uploaded, or how you can restrict. So definitely we'll come up with another topic. So since we are running out of time, I'll have another question, which is like, how do you kind of manage between static and dynamic context in MCP? We've been talking about context most of the time in MCP. So how has this been handled, or what's the difference between those in MCP purview?
From a static versus dynamic content, right? And I think they mentioned it at Build, where you're going to be able to get model tuning to produce, I wouldn't say contextualize. Well, from a response perspective, when we look at MCP servers, you can structure the way the agent is going to respond to you. And I think for me, the most important thing for me is how do we actually get it to, if you look at this response, right? So I asked, how do I ensure security of my data in a cloud environment? and it's actually brought it back in bulleted format. Now, from a response perspective, when you look at that MCP server, you would be able to structure the way the agent actually brings back, because you're going to have tokenization and inferences, and how it actually brings back the information, part in the response component of MCPs, and then also from a model tuning perspective, you'll be able to fine tune that.
Okay.
Although
Got
there's
it.
some questions in the chat from an MCP
Yes.
for Pablo,
Yeah.
how you would add. Yes, you could do it. Remember, this is an evolution of what the platform was, right? Okay, so Pablo's saying there's an evolution of what was original Power Virtual Agents, which was the chatbot service, right? That we had that lives inside of Power Automate, or at least inside of Power Apps. And now it's become Copilot Studio. So from a functional perspective, if we look at tools, and I actually want to go to Flow, hold on. That functionality around being able to bake, it opened up in a page. Let me just, new tool, model context protocol, and it's going to actually take you to a page that shows you, how to use either the MCP dev kit, building a connector or an agent by adding tools from there. So consume it via Copilot Studio, and now you can actually build or scaffold that with YAML, and then also, creating a custom connector. And this is actually where it shows you how to create a custom connector, so that you can pull that connector straight in. And I'm assuming this would also work if you are wanting to build a custom or add a custom MCP server to Foundry as well. Let me just have a look at that. Karthik has asked, MCP servers, one for each data source, such as a SQL database, NAS file systems, Postgres, or Azure Data Lake.
Okay.
Look, because this is new, you would typically have an MCP server that talks to a file system, right? Or and a separate MCP server that talks to Postgres. Because remember, from a contextualization perspective, if I'm connecting to a file server, the way it returns that results is going to be very different to me interrogating a database. I would say yes. It depends on how that query is going to work, but you would then have to add multiple MCP servers to the backend. And if you're consolidating that all together, where you've got a file share that you are going to want to find a file and then have metadata associated with that file that you're pulling from a database, I would want to run those things independently. And also from not necessarily from a scale perspective, but from a serverless architecture perspective, where if the file system MCP fails, you can still use the other MCPs. And then also, whoever the last one, stateless and stateful MCP server track. Yes, that is above my pay grade. I'm not that guy. I'm a level 200 MCP guy. I'm not a level 400. So the last one was, stateless or stateful, definitely. I agree with that. One more, can we do rate limit? And I don't know. Hey, when you're saying rate limit, Pablo, are you worrying about consumption? And that's going to be a performance thing, really. From making it simple directly in Copilot Studio, yes. There is a plan to make MCP servers, and remember, this is just, and because it's so new, right? Because it's so new, if I go to agents again, I mean, there's literally from Microsoft currently, they've only given you one MCP server that's out of the box, right? So from a tools perspective, if I say add a tool, I mean, this literally popped up 3 weeks ago, not even 3 weeks ago. This wasn't there before build. So this is brand new, right? Now, yes, I do believe that there's a lot of things coming over the next 6 months, and making it easier to connect to MCPs directly from Copilot Studio is coming. Right now, this was the first one that was ready to be deployed, and I think they announced their Fabric MCP server at build, but I would want an MCP server into SharePoint because I want to structure my data, and I also want to be able to pull metadata across. Because right now, connecting to knowledge inside of SharePoint, it's literally connecting to content, not metadata associated with said content. And we have asked for that, yeah. I think that's it, really.
Alistair, we need another session with loads of questions to be answered and a lot more burning questions people have to know more about MCP. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. And if you're looking for me, you can find me on LinkedIn or X, or just look for Alistair, at Alistair Pugin. And I'll happily continue this conversation on LinkedIn or Twitter /X or even Blue Sky or on Facebook. It's at Alistair Pugin everywhere.
Definitely. We're going to share, the team is going to share your social handles.
Fantastic.
So the audience are going to get in touch with you on LinkedIn or any of these mediums. So thank you so much, Alistair. That was definitely an eye-opener for a lot of us to know about MCP. Everybody had some vague idea about it. I think today's your session kind of gave a clear vision on a next level. So definitely, I think we would come up with another part 2 of MCP server to understand more about it. Thank you so much for being on Copilot Chronicles, and audience also. Thank you so much for being an awesome audience in encouraging the speaker with questions and coming up with more topics. So stay tuned. Thanks, Rashmita, for being a great host. So see you soon. Stay tuned for the next episode in Copilot Chronicles.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Ciao, ciao.